Hey everyone. Today we're tackling a question most people won't touch: the queens who reinvented intimate punishments to break their rivals. Forget the sanitized version. The truth is stranger and more revealing. Picture this: palaces with secret passages and whispered accusations that could destroy lives. But let's focus on the power dynamics, not the sensationalism. Throughout history, female rulers faced unique challenges in exercising power. Unlike kings who could simply order executions, queens often had to operate in more subtle and sometimes more psychologically devastating ways. They weaponized intimacy itself, turning bedchambers into battlegrounds and reputations into casualties of war. This isn't about bedroom gossip. It's about how women in positions of power navigated systems designed to exclude them, using the very prejudices against them as weapons. When direct violence wasn't an option, they invented punishments that could break rivals without spilling a drop of blood. Our journey begins in the Byzantine Empire, with Empress Theodora crosses the royal courts of France, England, Spain, China, and Russia, and ends with the bureaucratic world of Maria Theresa's Habsburg Empire. Before we dive in, I should note, this episode discusses historical allegations about private life in antiquity. No graphic detail. We'll focus on political implications and source bias. Much of what we know comes from hostile chroniclers with their own agendas. What matters isn't always the truth of the allegations, but how these women leveraged intimate spaces for political ends. So why does this matter? Because these queens rewrote the rules of power. When blocked from traditional methods of control, they created new ones, psychological punishments that sometimes proved more effective than the sword. Their innovations reveal not just personal vendettas, but sophisticated power strategies that changed how political warfare was conducted. You might think the most dangerous place in a royal palace was the dungeon, but these queens proved it was often the bedchamber, the drawing room, or the whispered conversation. Let's explore how they turned these spaces into weapons. If you're fascinated by how powerful women navigated hostile political landscapes, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below with which of these queens you want to hear more about in future videos. Now let's dive into our first royal innovator of intimate punishment. Empress Theodora of Byzantium might be the most fascinating ruler you've never really learned about. Rising from the Constantinople entertainment world to become the most powerful woman in the empire, she married Emperor Justinian, and together they ruled the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century. But Theodora's path to power wasn't conventional, and neither were her methods of maintaining it. Ancient biographers writing decades later, often with political grudges, report that her early life in Constantinople's entertainment scene gave her intimate knowledge of social vulnerabilities that she would later weaponize against her enemies. When she became empress, she faced a particular problem. As a woman from humble origins, traditional aristocrats constantly challenged her legitimacy. She couldn't simply execute them all without destabilizing the empire, so she developed something more surgical: intimate punishments that left her opponents alive but utterly broken. One of her most effective techniques targeted rival aristocratic women. Instead of exile or execution, Theodora would orchestrate elaborate social humiliations. According to the historian Procopius in his Secret History, a text dripping with hostility toward Theodora, she would manufacture romantic scandals around these women, not to titillate but to specifically undermine their family alliances. And let's be clear about Procopius. He's our main source on Theodora, but his Secret History reads like ancient tabloid journalism with a vendetta. Modern historians consider much of his personal attacks to be politically motivated character assassination. What's interesting isn't whether his specific claims are true, but the pattern of power he describes. Take the case of Antonina, wife of General Belisarius. When Theodora suspected her of becoming too politically influential, she didn't move against her directly. Instead, she allegedly manipulated evidence about Antonina's private life, ensuring it reached her husband in ways that destroyed their political partnership while leaving both technically unharmed. The genius of Theodora's approach was its deniability. No blood was spilled, no formal charges were filed, just the careful placement of information that turned powerful married couples against each other, neutralizing potential power centers that might challenge her. You know how in modern politics they say, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up? Theodora flipped that concept. She made the alleged private indiscretion more damaging than any public crime could be. She understood that in Byzantine society, a noblewoman's power stemmed from her family connections and moral standing. By undermining those foundations, she could neutralize opponents without creating martyrs. Theodora also institutionalized her methods. She established the metanoia, ostensibly a convent on the Bosporus shoreline. While presented as a religious retreat, contemporary sources suggest it functioned as a luxurious political prison where aristocratic women who challenged her were confined. Not tortured, not executed, just removed from the social fabric that gave them power and placed in a setting where their every communication was monitored. What makes this revolutionary is that these women disappeared from political life without the messy political consequences of execution. They lived in physical comfort while experiencing the psychological torture of complete irrelevance. Their families couldn't even claim persecution because officially these women were simply engaged in religious contemplation. Modern scholarship suggests that while Procopius exaggerated many claims, the pattern he describes aligns with how Theodora consolidated power in a system biased against female rulers. She created a new category of punishment, the socio-intimate execution, where the victim's body remained intact, but their social existence was terminated. Catherine de' Medici takes our exploration to 16th century France, where she elevated psychological warfare to an art form. As queen and then queen mother, she effectively ruled France for nearly 30 years through her sons, navigating the bloody religious wars between Catholics and Huguenots. Born into the powerful Medici banking family of Florence, Catherine arrived in France as a teenage bride and initially held little power. For 10 years, she couldn't even produce an heir, a vulnerability that nearly destroyed her position. During this time, she observed how French court politics worked, especially how women wielded influence through networks and information rather than direct authority. When her husband, King Henry II, died unexpectedly in a jousting accident, Catherine transformed from a neglected wife to the most powerful person in France. But she faced immediate challenges from powerful noble families, particularly the Guises, who saw her as a foreign interloper. This is where Catherine's innovation enters our story. Rather than meeting physical force with physical force, she created what historians now call her escadron volant, her flying squadron. This was a group of attractive and intelligent ladies-in-waiting who served as both her intelligence network and her political weapon. Let me be clear about what this wasn't. Contrary to salacious claims by hostile contemporaries, this wasn't some kind of royal seduction team. That characterization comes from her enemies, particularly Protestant propagandists, who portrayed her as Machiavellian and amoral. The historical reality was more sophisticated. The escadron volant were educated women placed strategically throughout court who gathered intelligence and sometimes formed relationships with men Catherine needed to influence. The true innovation was how she systematized what had previously been ad hoc court intrigue, turning personal relationships into political instruments. One infamous example involved Louis, Prince of Condé, a Huguenot leader potentially threatening Catherine's power. Rather than arresting him, which could have sparked civil war, Catherine allegedly had one of her ladies-in-waiting, Isabelle de Lamoille, develop a relationship with him. The intelligence gathered helped Catherine neutralize political threats while also creating leverage through potential scandal. What makes this so remarkable is how Catherine transformed traditional female disadvantages into strategic advantages. In an era when women were expected to focus on domestic and social matters rather than state affairs, she weaponized those very social connections. When denied official political channels, she built unofficial ones that proved more effective. Catherine also pioneered psychological isolation as punishment. For rivals at court, particularly women who challenged her authority, she would orchestrate their social ostracism without ever issuing a direct order. A word here, a rumor there, and suddenly a powerful duchess found herself excluded from vital social networks that were her source of influence. During the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a horrific event where thousands of Huguenots were killed, Catherine demonstrated the limits of her approach when crisis struck. But in the aftermath, she returned to her intimate punishment strategy, focusing on isolating and neutralizing potential threats through social manipulation rather than violence. What's particularly fascinating is how Catherine adapted Italian political philosophy, which she knew from her Florentine upbringing, to the realities of being a female ruler in France. She couldn't employ the direct methods Machiavelli advocated, so she created parallel systems that achieved similar ends through different means. By the time of her death in 1589, Catherine had fundamentally altered how political power operated in the French court. She proved that control of intimate spaces, bedchambers, salons, private conversations, could be more decisive than control of battlefields. She didn't just play the game, she changed its rules. Now let's travel east to Imperial China, where Empress Wu Zetian revolutionized how intimate punishments could dismantle political rivals. Rising from concubine to become China's only female emperor regnant in the Tang dynasty, Wu Zetian ruled from 690 to 705 CE, after decades of exercising power behind the throne. Wu faced obstacles that make other female rulers' challenges look trivial by comparison. Confucian doctrine explicitly positioned women as subordinate, making her rule fundamentally transgressive in Chinese political philosophy. She couldn't just defeat her enemies, she had to create an entirely new political framework that could accommodate female authority. Her approach to neutralizing rivals shows a level of psychological sophistication that still disturbs historians. But before diving into specifics, we need to acknowledge the source problem. Much of what we know comes from the official histories compiled after her death, written by Confucian scholars hostile to the very idea of female rule. They had every incentive to portray her punishments as excessive and perverse. What can be verified is that Wu developed a system of status inversion as punishment. For male officials who opposed her, she didn't just execute them, though she did that too when necessary. For those she wanted to make examples of, she created punishments that specifically attacked Confucian gender norms. In one documented case, Wu ordered a rival official to serve as a domestic servant to one of her female allies. This might not sound severe to modern ears, but in Tang Dynasty China, this gender role reversal represented a devastation of social identity more profound than physical torture. The man's entire position in the cosmic and social order was inverted. Wu also pioneered what scholars call reputation execution. When certain court officials or rival family members posed threats, she would meticulously destroy not just their current status, but ensure their names would carry shame for generations, a punishment far worse than death in a culture where ancestor veneration was central to spiritual life. The case of the Shangguan family illustrates her methods. After Shangguan Yi opposed her growing influence, Wu not only had him executed, but orchestrated an elaborate ritual humiliation of his family. His relatives were reduced to servant status, but in a twist that shows Wu's psychological acuity, she later elevated his granddaughter Shangguan Wan'er to become her own personal secretary. This demonstrated Wu's complete control over not just bodies, but entire family legacies. What makes Wu's approach distinctive is how she specifically designed punishments to undermine the Confucian value system that excluded female rule. By forcing powerful men to experience status inversions that feminized them, she attacked the very philosophical framework that questioned her legitimacy. During major holidays and ceremonies, Wu would sometimes require disgraced officials to perform ritual functions normally reserved for women or servants, while court witnessed. This wasn't just humiliation, it was the symbolic dismantling of the gender-based authority system that opposed her rule. Perhaps most dramatically, Wu created the cold palace concept, a specialized form of internal exile where disfavored concubines or female relatives were sent. Unlike regular banishment, women in the cold palace remained physically present at court but became socially invisible, a status death that left the person alive but removed from the flow of power and information. The psychological sophistication of this punishment was its liminality. These women existed in an in-between state, neither free nor imprisoned in traditional terms, neither court members nor outsiders. This ambiguity created profound psychological disorientation that broke even strong-willed opponents. What's remarkable about Wu's innovations is how they transformed temporary personal victories into institutional changes. By the time she died at age 81, after retiring under pressure, she had created entire bureaucratic structures dedicated to monitoring and enforcing social status, proving that intimate punishments could be systematized as effectively as physical ones. Let's move forward several centuries to Russia, where Catherine the Great refined intimate punishments into a diplomatic art form. Rising from German princess to Empress of Russia following a coup against her husband Peter III, Catherine ruled from 1762 to 1796, transforming Russia into a major European power. Catherine's situation differed from our previous queens. As an enlightened despot, she had access to traditional methods of punishment, exile to Siberia, imprisonment, even torture. But she recognized their limitations, particularly when dealing with aristocratic rivals too popular to eliminate directly or foreign enemies beyond her direct reach. What Catherine pioneered was reputation assassination as geopolitical strategy. She understood that in Enlightenment Europe, with its emerging public sphere of newspapers and coffeehouses, controlling the narrative could be more powerful than controlling territory. The case of Princess Dashkova illustrates Catherine's approach to internal rivals. Initially an ally who helped her seize power, Dashkova eventually became too independently influential. Rather than exile her, Catherine deployed what historians call the ceremony of forgiveness, a psychological torture disguised as mercy. She would publicly forgive Dashkova for offenses that were either minor or imaginary, forcing her to repeatedly perform gratitude while the court witnessed her humiliation. This performance maintained Catherine's image as magnanimous while simultaneously undermining Dashkova's dignity and independence. The princess remained physically safe but psychologically subjugated. Catherine refined this technique with her treatment of fallen court favorites. When former lovers fell from grace, she didn't banish them but instead kept them at court in diminished positions, creating living reminders of her power to elevate or diminish. These men retained their titles and wealth while losing actual influence, a status purgatory that prevented them from becoming either martyrs or genuine threats. What made Catherine's approach particularly effective was its integration with Enlightenment ideals. While privately deploying these psychological punishments, she publicly championed progressive values, corresponding with Voltaire and Diderot. This created a dual reality where victims of her intimate punishments couldn't even critique her methods without appearing to oppose progress itself. Her most innovative use of intimate punishment appeared in international relations. When King Gustav III of Sweden opposed her expansionist policies, Catherine didn't just deploy armies, she orchestrated a sophisticated campaign questioning his masculinity and competence that undermined his authority with his own nobles. Using her diplomatic connections, she ensured that unflattering stories about Gustav circulated in European courts, combining genuine political criticism with carefully crafted rumors about his private life. This wasn't mere gossip, but strategic deployment of reputation damage that weakened his negotiating position in international affairs. Catherine's correspondence reveals her deliberate approach. In letters to her ambassadors, she explicitly instructs them to cultivate certain perceptions of her rivals, focusing on character weaknesses that would undermine their political authority without ever making direct accusations that could be refuted. What's fascinating about Catherine's innovation is how she systematized reputation warfare. She established what amounted to an early version of political psychological operations, with her diplomatic corps trained to gather and deploy intimate information alongside traditional intelligence. One French diplomat noted that Catherine's court had perfected the science of ruin by implication, the ability to destroy a rival's effectiveness without ever making an accusation that could be directly challenged. This approach proved particularly effective against female rivals, who were vulnerable to reputation damage in ways male opponents were not. By the end of Catherine's reign, this approach had become so institutionalized that Russian diplomatic training included instruction in what we might now call social intelligence gathering, identifying personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited without resorting to traditional espionage or violence. In creating these methods, Catherine demonstrated how the Enlightenment's expansion of public discourse created new vulnerabilities that an astute ruler could exploit. When direct power was limited, she showed that controlling the conversation could achieve the same ends through different means. Our journey now takes us to England, where Queen Elizabeth I developed perhaps the most sophisticated system of intimate punishments in royal history. Ruling from 1558 to 1603, Elizabeth faced extraordinary challenges: a questioned legitimacy, constant threats of invasion, religious division, and the fundamental problem of being an unmarried female monarch in a patriarchal society. Elizabeth's innovation was turning the very expectations of femininity into weapons of statecraft. Unlike our previous queens, she couldn't rely on a husband or sons for legitimacy. She had to create an entirely new model of female sovereignty, and with it, new methods of controlling those who opposed her. The case of Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, illustrates Elizabeth's approach. When this favorite overstepped his bounds, she didn't immediately resort to execution, though that eventually came after his rebellion. Instead, she developed what historians now call ceremonial humiliation, public rituals of submission that broke rivals psychologically before any physical punishment became necessary. After Essex returned unauthorized from Ireland, Elizabeth required him to stand before her council, bareheaded, in a deliberately low-status position for hours while she deliberately ignored him. He remained physically unharmed, but was stripped of the dignity that was the currency of aristocratic power. Contemporaries reported he emerged from this experience a broken man, his confidence, the source of his political threat, shattered. What made Elizabeth's approach unique was her theatrical sensibility. She staged these punishments as performances with symbolic significance understood by the Renaissance mind. When Lady Catherine Grey married without royal permission, Elizabeth didn't just imprison her. She placed her in custody arranged to specifically evoke her tenuous position in the succession, a daily reminder of the royal authority she had challenged. Elizabeth pioneered what scholars call the punishment of access. In a court where proximity to the monarch determined power, she weaponized her own availability. Favorites who displeased her found themselves physically present at court but ignored, a devastating limbo that court observers understood as a form of execution of status. Contemporary ambassadors noted Elizabeth's method of looking through disfavored courtiers as if they were invisible. In the tight social world of Tudor court, this visual banishment was more devastating than physical exile, as the victim witnessed their own irrelevance while unable to claim persecution. What's particularly fascinating is how Elizabeth used intimacy itself as both reward and punishment. The same touch of the hand or private conversation that could elevate a courtier could be withdrawn to devastate them. She systematized emotional access as a form of political currency, creating an economy of affection that she alone controlled. The Spanish ambassador reported with frustration that Elizabeth had developed a system where men of consequence find themselves undone without a word spoken against them. This silent punishment left victims with no specific charge to defend against, just the overwhelming experience of favor withdrawn. Elizabeth also innovated in gender-specific punishments. For female rivals, particularly those whose beauty or youth might challenge her, she developed what one historian calls sartorial punishment. She would issue specific dress requirements that subtly highlighted unflattering features or symbolically reduced status in ways only the court would fully recognize. Mary Sidney, after recovering from smallpox, found herself required to appear at court functions where the lighting and her assigned clothing drew attention to her scars, a psychological cruelty disguised as routine court procedure. No official punishment was recorded, yet the message to other ladies was clear. Even more sophisticated was Elizabeth's use of portraiture as political punishment. By controlling how rivals were depicted in court paintings, their positioning, attributes, even the color schemes associated with them, she created visual propaganda that could damage a reputation without a single accusation being made. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, she had created an entire symbolic language of favor and disgrace that allowed her to neutralize threats without creating martyrs. She proved that in the Renaissance world of symbol and performance, controlling representation could be as effective as controlling physical bodies. Elizabeth's methods demonstrate how a queen with limited traditional authority could create alternative systems of power and punishment by manipulating the very social expectations designed to constrain her. When denied the sword, she weaponized the gaze. Isabella of Castile brings us to late 15th century Spain, where this Catholic monarch transformed intimate punishment into instruments of state formation. Ruling Castile from 1474 and helping unify Spain through her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon, Isabella faced the challenge of consolidating power in a deeply fragmented kingdom. Isabella's innovation wasn't creating new forms of punishment, but rather institutionalizing intimate control through what would become the Spanish Inquisition. While the Inquisition is often discussed in religious terms, Isabella's deployment of it reveals a sophisticated understanding of how regulating private life could serve state power. What made Isabella's approach distinctive was its focus on lineage and blood purity. By targeting conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, and moriscos, Muslim converts, she created a system where intimate family history became grounds for political exclusion. This wasn't just religious persecution. It was the weaponization of ancestry itself. Spanish historian Rodriguez Salgado notes how Isabella transformed traditional concepts of honor into instruments of state control. By elevating limpieza de sangre, blood purity, to official policy, she ensured that even the most private aspect of identity, family origin, became grounds for political punishment. Consider the case of Luis de Santangel, a converso who actually financed Columbus's voyage. Despite his service to the crown, his Jewish ancestry remained a vulnerability that Isabella's system could activate at any moment. This created a form of perpetual psychological subjugation that required constant performances of loyalty. What made this system an intimate punishment was its invasion of previously private domains. Inquisition investigations delved into family recipes, bathroom habits, and bedroom practices to identify crypto-Jews or crypto-Muslims. The very patterns of domestic life became evidence that could destroy a family's status. The genius and horror of this system was how it turned families against themselves. One documented case shows a husband denouncing his wife for secretly practicing Jewish rituals in their kitchen. The intimate knowledge that comes with family life became a surveillance tool serving state power. Isabella didn't invent religious persecution, but she systematized it in ways that specifically attacked the boundary between public and private. The home, traditionally a space outside direct royal control, became a site of investigation and potential criminality. For female subjects, Isabella's system created gender-specific vulnerabilities. Women, as keepers of domestic traditions and food preparation, faced particular scrutiny. The preparation of certain dishes or cleaning practices could be interpreted as secret adherence to Jewish or Muslim customs, turning everyday household management into potential treason. What makes Isabella's case particularly complex is that she was herself a female monarch deploying systems that often disadvantaged other women. She created institutional structures that would outlast her reign, transforming temporary political victories into permanent changes in how private life was regulated. The psychological sophistication of this approach appears in how it created what scholars call internalized surveillance. Targeted populations began to monitor their own most intimate behaviors, creating exactly the kind of self-regulating subjects that emerging nation-states required. This wasn't just religious fervor. It was statecraft. By controlling the intimate aspects of identity and family life, Isabella established royal authority in domains previously beyond direct monarchical reach. When she couldn't control territory effectively, she instead controlled the personal lives of those who inhabited it. The case of converso courtier Andrés Cabrera illustrates the psychological complexity of this system. Despite his high position and demonstrated loyalty, his Jewish ancestry remained a permanent vulnerability. Court records show his excessive demonstrations of Catholic piety, not from religious conviction, but as necessary performance to counter suspicions from his background. This created a distinctive form of psychological punishment, the impossibility of security. No matter how wealthy or accomplished, those with targeted backgrounds lived with the knowledge that intimate details of their family history could at any moment become grounds for disgrace. By institutionalizing these methods through the Inquisition, Isabella ensured her system would continue beyond her lifetime. She transformed what might have been temporary political tactics into permanent structures of state control that would shape Spanish society for centuries. While Isabella's methods seem distant from modern sensibilities, their logic persists in surprising ways. Whenever states regulate intimate behavior or private identity as matters of national security, they draw from the playbook she helped establish. Our examination culminates with Maria Theresa of Austria, who ruled the Habsburg domains from 1740 to 1780 and developed what might be called bureaucratized intimate punishment. As one of the great state builders of early modern Europe, she faced the challenge of modernizing a sprawling multi-ethnic empire while fending off threats from Prussia and other powers. What makes Maria Theresa's approach distinctive was how she integrated intimate punishments into administrative structures, creating systems that regulated private life through impersonal bureaucracy rather than personal royal intervention. This represented the modernization of methods our previous queens deployed more directly. The Chastity Commission, established in Vienna in 1751, exemplifies her innovation. While ostensibly focused on public morality, this institution systematically monitored private behavior, particularly among the aristocracy. Noble families found their intimate lives subject to official scrutiny in ways that transformed traditional court politics into matters of administrative procedure. Historian James Van Horn Melton notes how Maria Theresa weaponized the emerging concept of bourgeois morality against aristocratic rivals. By establishing public standards of private conduct, she created new vulnerabilities for noble families whose traditional privilege had previously protected them from such scrutiny. Consider the case of Prince Wenzel von Liechtenstein. When he opposed Habsburg policies, Maria Theresa's response wasn't direct confrontation, but rather an intensive investigation of his family finances and personal habits. This administrative intrusion proved more effective than traditional political punishment, as it undermined the very boundaries between public and private that aristocratic power relied upon. What made this approach so psychologically sophisticated was its impersonality. Unlike earlier queens who delivered punishment directly, Maria Theresa created systems where the punishment seemed to come from abstract principles rather than royal will. This made resistance more difficult, as there was no single act of persecution to oppose, just the grinding pressure of bureaucratic scrutiny. For female subjects, Maria Theresa's policies created particular forms of intimate regulation. Her famous measures against prostitution weren't just moral campaigns, but systems for controlling women's social and economic independence. The Commission, Chastity Commission, could order examinations of women suspected of sexual impropriety, a profound invasion of bodily autonomy justified by administrative rather than religious principles. Maria Theresa also pioneered what scholars call disciplinary welfare. Her establishment of the Viennese General Hospital in 1784 created an institution that simultaneously provided care and exercised control. Unwed mothers, for example, received necessary medical attention while being subjected to moral re-education programs. Help and punishment merged into a single administrative process. The psychological effectiveness of this approach appears in how it eliminated traditional sites of resistance. When punishment comes directly from a monarch, subjects can at least maintain internal opposition. But when intimate regulation is embedded in seemingly neutral administrative structures, resistance itself becomes more difficult to conceptualize. Maria Theresa's correspondence reveals her deliberate development of these methods. In letters to her daughter Marie Antoinette, she explicitly advises using administrative measures rather than direct confrontation when dealing with court rivals in France. This transfer of techniques between courts shows how these approaches were becoming systematized as governance strategies. What's particularly significant about Maria Theresa's innovation is how it bridges pre-modern and modern forms of power. By bureaucratizing intimate punishment, she translated traditional monarchical authority into administrative systems that would survive in various forms into the modern state. The case of Chancellor Kaunitz demonstrates the effectiveness of her approach. When this powerful minister became too independent, Maria Theresa didn't dismiss him, but instead created administrative review procedures that subjected his decisions to layers of committee oversight. He remained in office, but found his authority quietly undermined by bureaucratic processes rather than royal decree. In establishing these systems, Maria Theresa demonstrated how intimate punishments could be institutionalized in ways that outlasted any individual ruler. The regulatory state she helped pioneer would continue monitoring and disciplining private life long after personal monarchy had faded. While Maria Theresa is often portrayed as a conservative ruler, her innovations in administrative intimate control were remarkably forward-looking. She anticipated how modern states would regulate private behavior through bureaucratic systems rather than direct sovereign intervention. This evolution from personal to systematic, intimate punishment represents the culmination of our story. What began as individual queens developing specific techniques culminated in the creation of administrative structures that would transform how power itself operated. Now that we've explored how these remarkable queens reinvented intimate punishment, let's examine the patterns that connect their innovations and consider their lasting impact on how power operates. The first pattern that emerges is adaptation to constraint. Each of these queens faced significant limitations on their authority, whether from gender expectations, institutional barriers, or cultural restrictions. Rather than accepting these limitations, they developed alternative systems of control focused on domains traditionally considered beyond direct political authority. When denied command of armies, they commanded reputations. When excluded from formal legal processes, they created informal systems of social regulation. When unable to execute rivals directly, they executed their social standing instead. These adaptations weren't just personal survival tactics, but genuine innovations in how power could function. The second pattern is the politicization of previously private domains. Each queen extended political control into spaces previously considered separate from politics: bedchambers, family histories, domestic rituals, personal relationships. By making the intimate political, They created new territories for royal authority when traditional domains were restricted. Empress Wu's cold palace, Catherine de' Medici's salon networks, Elizabeth's economy of royal favor, all represented the transformation of supposedly non-political spaces into sites of sophisticated political control. This expansion of politics into private life anticipates many aspects of modern power that we now take for granted. The third pattern is psychological sophistication. These punishments weren't crude substitutes for physical penalties, but psychologically precise interventions designed for specific cultural contexts. They targeted aspects of identity that mattered most in their respective societies. Confucian gender roles in Tang China, aristocratic honor in Tudor England, blood purity in Reconquista Spain. This psychological precision made these punishments particularly effective. Physical torture might break bodies, but intimate punishments broke the social foundations that gave individuals meaning and purpose. They attacked not just power, but identity itself. A fourth pattern appears in how these methods evolved from personal to institutional. What began as individual tactics developed by specific queens gradually transformed into systems embedded in state structures. Theodora's informal networks became Catherine's diplomatic corps. Isabella's religious investigations became Maria Theresa's administrative commissions. This institutionalization ensured these innovations outlasted their creators. Long after these queens died, the systems they pioneered continued regulating intimate life and punishing those who challenged authority. Personal innovation became lasting institutional change. The fifth and perhaps most significant pattern is how these methods undermined the traditional public-private distinction that often protected male authority. In societies where politics was defined as public and masculine, creating political consequences for private behavior represented a fundamental challenge to existing power structures. When Elizabeth made court favor dependent on personal loyalty rather than official position, when Isabella made family history grounds for political exclusion, they weren't just punishing individual rivals, they were challenging the very categories that structured political life. So what does this historical exploration tell us about power itself? These queens revealed that power doesn't just operate through official channels and formal authority. It works through reputation, through access, through identity, through the intimate knowledge that comes from close proximity. Their innovations continue to shape how we experience power today. When we worry about our online reputations, when we see private behavior becoming grounds for public consequences, when we experience the blurring of personal and political, we're living with the legacy of techniques these queens pioneered. This isn't to suggest direct historical continuity or to claim these queens invented all aspects of social control. Rather, their stories reveal recurring patterns in how power adapts when faced with constraints, how authority extends into new domains when traditional avenues are blocked. For modern audiences, these historical cases offer perspective on contemporary concerns about privacy, reputation, and identity. The weaponization of intimate information isn't unique to our digital age. It has a long and sophisticated history that these queens help illuminate. Perhaps the most important insight is how necessity drives innovation. These queens didn't develop these methods because they were inherently more devious or manipulative than their male counterparts. They did so because traditional paths to power were often closed to them, forcing creative adaptation that revealed new possibilities for how authority could function. In studying these queens, we're not just exploring historical curiosities, but examining alternative models of power that emerge when conventional authority is constrained. Their stories remind us that power is always more complex, more adaptable, and more intimately woven into social life than formal structures suggest. As we conclude our exploration of how queens reinvented intimate punishments, I want to address a question that might be lingering. Were these methods uniquely female, or do they simply represent what happens when any ruler faces constraints on their authority? The evidence suggests something more nuanced than either extreme would indicate. These techniques weren't essentially female in nature. Male rulers sometimes employed similar approaches when circumstances demanded. But they were developed and systematized by women rulers precisely because gender constraints made traditional exercise of power more difficult. The historical record shows that when male rulers had access to direct methods, armies, executioners, formal legal processes, they typically preferred them. It was women rulers, frequently denied these direct tools, who fully developed the potential of intimate punishment as political strategy. This pattern reveals something profound about power itself. Constraint breeds innovation. When direct paths are blocked, new and sometimes more sophisticated alternatives emerge. These queens didn't choose subtlety because of some inherent female preference for indirection, but because circumstances demanded creative adaptation. Consider the larger historical context. As states became more bureaucratized in the early modern period, all rulers, regardless of gender, found themselves increasingly relying on administrative rather than personal power. Maria Theresa's bureaucratized, intimate controls weren't just a female approach, but an anticipation of how modern governance would function more broadly. So what's the lasting significance of these queens' innovations? They demonstrated that power doesn't just flow through official channels, but permeates social relationships, reputation systems, and identity itself. They revealed that controlling narratives about people can sometimes be more effective than controlling their physical bodies. These insights remain relevant in our contemporary world. When we worry about cancel culture, surveillance capitalism, or reputation damage, we're grappling with dynamics these queens would have immediately recognized. The weaponization of intimate knowledge has a much longer history than our digital moral panics suggest. What these queens ultimately teach us is that power is more adaptable, more pervasive, and more intimately connected to identity than conventional political theory often acknowledges. When denied access to the sword, they didn't become powerless. They revolutionized how power itself could function. Their stories complicate simplistic narratives about historical progress or gender essentialism. They weren't simply victims of patriarchal systems, nor were they operating outside those systems entirely. Instead, they worked within constraints while simultaneously transforming the very structures that constrained them. This complexity makes their innovations all the more significant. They didn't just survive in systems designed to exclude them. They reimagined how those systems could function, creating methodologies of power that would outlast the gender restrictions that necessitated their development. As we navigate our own era's evolving relationship between public and private, between personal identity and political consequence, these historical examples offer valuable perspective. The weaponization of intimate information isn't a digital invention, but a recurring feature of how power adapts to changing circumstances. So the next time you hear about reputation damage, social ostracism, or the political consequences of private behavior, remember that you're witnessing techniques with a sophisticated lineage, methods that queens pioneered when denied more direct paths to power. Their innovations remind us that power never simply disappears when its conventional expressions are blocked. It transforms, finding new channels and sometimes becoming more subtle and pervasive in the process. Theodora, Catherine de' Medici, Wu Zetian, Elizabeth I, Isabella, Catherine the Great, and Maria Theresa didn't just exercise power despite constraints, they revolutionized how power itself could operate. In doing so, they wrote a crucial chapter in political history that conventional accounts often overlook, a history not just of who ruled, but of how the very nature of rule itself evolved. Their legacy isn't just in what they accomplished as individual queens, but in how they collectively transformed the grammar of power itself. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of how queens reinvented intimate punishments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the subtle mechanics of power, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which ruler you want to see next. Until next time.